I think that we set ourselves up for failure when we have this perspective of like life needs to be exciting all the time and I need to be pursuing my passions all the time. It really is that sort of like main character syndrome of like, if I'm not doing everything that I love, then I feel purposeless. And if you can't learn to enjoy life in the mundane things, then you're never actually going to be satisfied.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to What Matters Media. My name is Matthew Baker, and today we talk to my friend Ben Counts. He's such an amazing guy that loves people, loves to serve, and has done that in so many different ways, from different jobs to different ministries and all different kinds of things. And he talks also about what we do when we're not doing our passions, but we're just doing the mundane, and how we love people and love Jesus in the mundane. So without me saying the whole episode, let's get in. So how's it going, Ben?
It's going great. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining me in the barber chair.
Yeah, this is fun, man.
Yeah.
Love what you've done with the place.
Yeah, I was talking to Ken at the last interview. We kind of do a couple in a row about how we met, and it's kind of a long story, but it's neat how through just some stuff in Harrisburg with ministry and different things, where I just kind of jumped in at a really interesting time in my walk with God. Tannen was on a couple episodes before, so if you look back at his intro, that was kind of how I got involved with that. But you were working with Wild Heart, and through like a mutual friend, we just kind of started hanging out, and it's pretty cool to see where it's evolved in our friendship. And we don't see each other all the time, but it's always like a good rekindling of friendship. So it's really cool.
No, it's great.
Yeah.
We were joking about like how we spent many nights together sleeping in the same room, and how that forged our friendship through a mutual friend of ours, and how we're ultimately better friends now than you and Ricky ever were. So.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of our conversations had to do with some really some things really heavy. Some I remember some really deep conversations about life and about growing. Some really crazy experiences with ladies. Yeah, mostly from your perspective, but just different experiences with girls that we had. And all different kind of stuff that we talked about. Pretty much anything and everything. As I slept on your floor trying to save some money from driving over an hour home to be there in Harrisburg. This was kind of when I was in barber school. Yeah. So it was just a lot of really really fun times. Eating donuts at too late at night. Go out to that donut place, Duck Donuts or something. Yeah. And it's been really cool getting to know you and seeing just you're a super fun, goofy dude. But you also know how to kind of switch on to a place of like, hey, this stuff's important in life and important to people. So I really appreciate that about you. So, So tell us a little bit about how you got to Pennsylvania, just that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty crazy story that feels pretty random. So if it feels random to anybody that's watching me talk about this, it also feels random to me. I mean, the short version of that story, I say the short version, really the long version of that story. So I kind of grew up in Oklahoma. It's easier to say that's where I'm from, even though we were just joking about I was born in Alaska. Lived in Japan for 6 years. My parents were missionaries. And so, but I grew up in Oklahoma a lot, so it's just easier to say that I'm from there. And so, when I turned 19, my family actually moved back to Japan. And so I was just kind of living there on my own in Oklahoma and working at Starbucks, which, I mean, shout out to any fake barista that's ever worked at Starbucks. I'm just kidding. You're a real barista, but it's just not as real as some of the other ones. But just working at Starbucks, not really sure what I wanted to do with my life. Spent a lot of time in like prayer and being a part of different ministries in Oklahoma City, but like nothing ever felt like it was sticking to me. And like you said, Tannen, who was on here a few episodes ago, great friend of mine. I've known him since I was 6. We grew up going to the same church. Nice. And when I graduated high school, I started going on mission trips with him and his wife and the organization that they were working for at the time. And so they had moved out to Pennsylvania, I want to say in 2013. And so around that time period, which was when my parents moved, they had invited me to move out here with them and to join a discipleship school they were running at the time. And so at that period of my life, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so I was very iffy about that idea and was just kind of like I'm not really sure. But the more I kept thinking about it, and the more I realized I actually hate working at Starbucks. Surprise. I realized like maybe there actually is something to this. And honestly, one morning I woke up and I felt like God said, "Hey, move to Pennsylvania." So I was like, "All right, I'm doing it."
Yeah.
It was very spontaneous. I did it very quickly. I didn't have a lot of money at the time, so I just packed everything that I could fit in my car and sold everything else and moved up here kind of on a whim. And the fun part of this story, which I think I don't know if fun's the right word, but when I actually first got here, I met someone that I thought I was in love with at the time. And so I actually ended up moving to DC for a year within a month of like getting to Pennsylvania.
Oh, dang.
And I don't know why I'm telling that part of the story.
That's okay. Go for it.
But yeah, I ended up moving to DC for a year to join a different organization that this girl was also joining, and convinced myself that that's actually what the Lord wanted me to do, as we all do when we're young and dumb. And realized about a year into that I had completely missed the mark. And so ended up coming back to Pennsylvania and joining up with Tannen and Christina in the ministry that they were running, and have been here pretty much ever since. So, yeah, it's been a sort of roundabout way of getting where the Lord wanted me, but also I wouldn't change that for anything, because there's invaluable lessons that you learn along the way.
Oh yeah, and I think that's kind of a part of most people's journey is figuring out what is the right way to go.
Yeah,
and what is next, and it's really a big question that I think we all have in every single stage of our life is, what's next?
Yeah. No, I think that's something too. I mean, I'm currently in a position where that's what I'm wondering. And then I think about that and I'm like, oh, wait, that's like every year of my life.
Yeah.
Like there's never there's never or at least, I don't want to say never, but I've yet to experience a point in my life where it's not that I'm looking for something else or looking for something more fulfilling, but just like wondering, like, how does this take me where I feel like the Lord is calling me? Or maybe more so the question for me recently is like, is this taking me where the Lord is calling me, or where is the Lord calling me? It's I think that there's always that sort of line of questioning, and I mean, I don't know if maybe this is just more of my personality. I don't know if anybody else relates to this, but like I like to think through those things, and so I would much rather have all the answers figured out
For sure.
Before I sort of make a big decision, especially like, I mean, and there's maybe some people don't relate to this at all, but like even something as simple as like buying new sheets. Like I recently did that, but I spent like probably 8 hours researching like the best possible sheets that I could find. And
no, I'm the same way.
Overthinking, right? And and so like when it comes to like big decisions in my life, I think I can often do the same thing. But something that I've learned is that you rarely figure out the answers just sitting around thinking through it, and you really do figure them out when you just pull the trigger and you go and you try something new and you fail or make a mistake, or maybe you figure it out. But that tends to be more so when I feel the Lord's direction in my life, is when I just make a commitment to doing something and moving in a direction, and then letting the Lord sort of course correct from there if he needs to.
Yeah. And I think that's something big that I've been kind of going through in my life right now is being like, God, I don't know what is next in my life, and but I'm taking these steps, and I know they're good steps.
Right.
Whether it's this YouTube channel, whether it's looking for barbers, or wondering like where this shop's gonna take me.
Yeah.
Or whether it's trying to find someone who I want to spend the rest of my life with. Like there's all these questions that we can have and try to figure out, because we want to be the most efficient.
Right.
But efficiency is never, if you go to the Bible, like efficiency was never the goal.
Yeah, for sure.
Because if God was about efficiency, as soon as Adam sinned and created this separation from God, he would have created a way a lot sooner. And when Jesus came, he wouldn't have come as a baby.
Right.
Like, that's not the most efficient way to save the world.
Well, I think it's interesting too, like you're saying that, but it also, like, we're talking about, an eternal being who, is not short of time, where it's like our time on earth is ultimately finite, and one day all of us are going to die. And so, like, efficiency to me is, right now. But God in his ways and the way that he works is just a completely different perspective, because he's not bound by time. And I think that we can so often just think through things so short-sightedly in the perspective of, how does this impact me, when, maybe the answer is this isn't going to impact me, but this is actually going to impact the people who come after me. And that's just as valuable as you living your life and being impacted and having an impact on the earth.
Yeah, and that's what I like that kind of thought pattern, because I think of, you said God is infinite.
Right.
We are not. And a lot of us think of ourselves as the main character.
Yeah.
And we try to kind of imagine what the culmination of our life will be. And we want this clean story that looks like it's not wasted. But a lot of times it's not a clean story. Yeah. And sometimes it doesn't even look finished. Yeah. At the end of it. And I think we all have been left with at least one person that we've seen who's not here with us anymore, that we can say, man, that didn't feel right. Yeah. And with that, I think there's hope, because I think what that shows us is that this is not the end, because it wasn't right. It wasn't what God had. It wasn't the end of the story. Right. And I think of I'm doing this Bible plan where with a couple people, and it's called the 30-day shred is what they call it. Yeah. But it's basically reading through the Bible in 30 days. Yeah, it's like 50 chapters a day, right? Yeah, somewhere around that, somewhere in the 40s, 50s range, depending on how long the chapters are. And I mean, it's nothing great on me. Like it's really not like the best study tool. Sure. But what is really great about it is being intentional with it to see the full picture, the full story. Yeah. And so, seeing literally thousands of years within 30 days of history, it lets you see that, these people's stories were all pointing to Jesus. Yeah. And these people after Jesus are still pointing back to Jesus, and are pointing to what he will bring. Yeah. The joy that we'll have on the other side of what we're experiencing. But when you look at, what's his name, Samson's life, I think most people know at least the character of Samson as a character. But he was kind of a stuck-up dude. He wasn't really a great person. But God used him to bring justice to some people that were really being oppressed. Yeah. And in his kind of like cockiness, in his really terrible mindset, in a lot of ways, God used that. But even, one of the last verses in his story, it says that Samson, by killing these Philistines, he was bringing justice to people that were being oppressed by the Philistines. Right. And he had killed more Philistines in his death when God used him to kind of push down the pillars and destroy this temple with all these people in it. He was used more in his death than he was in his life. And it's really interesting that the perspective of what we accomplish isn't sometimes seen in our life, but also not even also in our lifetime. That there's people like Abraham who in his life, he was promised to father a nation. And really, he only saw like a couple sons live. But he was the father of the Israelite nation, which was eventually the way that God used Jesus to be in that family line to bless the whole world, which is So it's like our stories are so much bigger.
Yeah,
that was a very roundabout way to say like our stories are so much bigger.
But it's funny. It's funny, like even you talking about sort of like main character syndrome. I mean, to be honest, I feel like more of like the jester in the king's court, like 99% of the time. But, I mean, just look at how Matt was combing my hair earlier. You know, that doesn't say jester. You know, but I mean, it's so true. Like I think I don't want to, like, this isn't to diminish the value of any individual or human being, because we're all immensely valuable. And we all have a story, and we all have a life. And so it's not to say you're not interesting. I mean, we've all probably met somebody that we thought that about, if we're being honest, but like, it's not true. Like, everybody's interesting in their own ways. But to your point, it really is, like, life is so much bigger and should be so much bigger than just about like what we're doing in a moment and for our immediate selves or the people immediately around us. But like we should be striving to leave an impact around us that will outlast us. And there's a lot of different ways you can go about doing that. And you don't even necessarily have to even be a Christian to do that. For positive or negative, I guess. I don't know the word. But like, I think that there is, I don't know that I want to say it's not innately human, but I think that it's not as easily accessible to want to live your life that way, because it is more fun when you're doing things that are for you and you're, you know.
When people are validating you. And when
exactly.
Who doesn't want people to say something good about them? Or think something good about them. And in kind of that vein of things, like, so you kind of going back to a little bit of your story. Like you've come from a place of you lived in all these different places, and then you're in Pennsylvania, and but you were really in this place have fit a role that really needed to be fit. And talk a little bit about what you do with Wild Heart and kind of your journey, because you've worked there and you worked somewhere else and came back. Just talk a little bit about that journey of what you've done and how you've fit into that role. I mean, it's when you work in ministry long enough, you wear many different hats. Really, actually, you could probably, when you work for any organization or company or business for long enough, you wear many different hats, and that's kind of a little bit of my journey. I've done everything from lead missions trips all over the U.S. to now more so my role is like a director position, and so that's a lot of like conversations about money and volunteers and all sorts of things. So I guess just as like a refresher, like the main focus of our organization Wild Heart really is gathering volunteers to come in and do very simple acts of service through beautification efforts within inner city Harrisburg, more specifically Allison Hill. And so a lot of the role that I've existed in previously kind of has been more revolved around like getting people in and volunteering and making sure that our mission and our vision is spreading through actually like having people come and show up and volunteer. And so in that, it's definitely been an interesting journey, because like you said, I was there for, I want to say, about 6 years, and kind of went through some stuff. I think the easiest way of maybe saying that is I just got to a point where I was burnt out, but also just needed like a change of pace with where I was at. And so I think maybe a little bit more vulnerably, I just went through some really traumatic stuff. I mean, you work in the inner city long enough and you see some things that you can't unsee necessarily. And so in some ways you're dealing with the worst parts of humanity. And so I went through just a really traumatic time and wasn't really sure like where to go from there. I wasn't sure how to find the Lord in that. And it took a while to even like recognize like, hey, like I need healing and I need time away, and I just need to hit that sort of reset button. And so part of that ended up looking like I sort of took a chance. Well, I say I took a chance. It was really more they took a chance on me. I went and worked for a multimedia marketing organization and don't really have a background in anything like that at all. But they brought me onto their sales team, so I kind of felt like Dwight Schrute a little bit. Maybe not as good or as attractive, but
But yeah, went there for a little bit, 3 months to be exact, and the department that I was working with ended up getting closed, and so I got laid off because of that. 3 months into that, and so it was a really challenging period of my life, just in the sense of I'm going through healing from something really traumatic that happened to me, to now, like, I thought that this was going to be good. I thought I heard the Lord on this, and I don't have a job anymore. That really sucks. And so I kind of was like the dog with my tail between my legs, like going back to Wild Heart. And I remember the day that I got laid off, I called Tana and was like, hey, can I come talk to you? Because we've obviously remained really close friends throughout the years. And so ended up going back and having a conversation, and you know, they were like, well, we don't really have the budget to hire you, but like we can create something more or less like through the summer. And so went and worked there again. So this would have been in 2022. Worked there for, I guess, really about 6 months through the summer. Ended up going back to Oklahoma, moving in with my parents, and was, again, like not at all what I was expecting, especially like being 27 at that time, getting ready to turn 28, like felt like a total failure, was so unsure of what I wanted to do in life at that point. Was really like, didn't feel like I was hearing the Lord a lot, or at least not very clearly. And just honestly had zero direction for my life at that point. All I could really say for certain was that like I knew I wanted to come back to PA. I just didn't know how or when that was going to happen. And so stayed in Oklahoma for 3 months. And then again, sort of got a call from Tana and was like, hey, we need your help. And I moved back up here. And have been here ever since. Again, cool. So it's kind of been like I don't know, like prodigal son is like the right like phraseology here, but have come and gone like several times through the ebbs and flows of life. And that process has been really exhausting. It's been really hard, but it's also it's made me a better person, and it's kept me in some sense true to who I am, as far as like I'm a deeply loyal person, and I have a hard time giving up on things if I feel like it's like unfinished or it's not been completed. And so I think the beauty of how I've gotten back here multiple times has really just been the grace of God to allow me to experience the things that I've experienced in order to help the people that He's called me to help. And so I love being here. I love what I do. And you know, I think, to be honest as well, like it's not at all what I thought I would be doing with my life, and I would also say it's probably not what I want to be doing with my life. And that's not to say I know it can sound sort of contradictory when it's like I love what I do, but I don't want to be doing it. Like it's not quite that simple. Obviously, I really do love what I do, but also like. I mean,
the things that you're passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to ask, 10-year-old version of me, like, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? Actually, this is a really funny conversation. This is like a side note, but
go for it.
My parents asked me, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was like really into skateboarding at the time, and I was like, I'm going to be a professional skateboarder. Yeah. And I remember my mom saying something along the lines of like, why don't you pick something that you're good at? And it's true, I was very bad at skateboarding. You know, like how the skateboarders, they ollie down the steps, like, they do their kickflip. I would just like ride my skateboard down the steps, like, so it's just like, really bumpy, but like, I never, but yeah, like
Why don't you pick something you're good
why don't you pick something you're good at, Ben? But I think, we all
Crush
sort of,
dream.
right, I needed to hear that probably, and it obviously didn't ruin me, so Mom, if you're listening to this, it didn't ruin me. But I think along those lines, like, there's a lot of things that we get passionate about through life, and there's a lot of things and dreams and aspirations that we all have, but ultimately, I find that those things aren't fulfilling if I'm not doing them if God hasn't called me to do them, or if I'm doing them when God hasn't called me to do them. I do find those things to be less fulfilling, and so for me, it's always been more important of like, where am I needed, where am I called, and so I think that sometimes there's that conflict of like, I have this dream and I have this passion. How does this fit into what I'm doing right now? And sometimes the answer is simply, it doesn't. Like, I love something that I've been into recently is like astrophotography. And part of that is just, I'm a real nerd about space and the stars. I'm actually in school right now studying physics. And so that was like a recent decision of mine to go back to school. But
that's cool.
It's something I'm very passionate about, something I've been passionate about since I was a little kid. Don't really know how any of that fits into my life at the moment. And I don't know that it ever will. And or at least from a like profession standpoint, like it's just something I sort of was like, hey, like I feel passionate about this. I'm going to pursue this. I'm going to make a decision. So like the astrophotography last year, I sort of willy-nilly bought a camera. I don't know anything about photography. I do now. But at the time, didn't know anything. So I made this like investment into my life, which had no way of like seemingly ever paying itself off. And other than I enjoy this and I want to get into it. And so I've done that with a lot of different things in my life. But ultimately, I'm sharing that, I think, from a perspective of, I think that we often take this approach of all or nothing, where it's like, I'm going to do this and nothing else. And I admire those people, and I think that there's something beautiful about a drive of someone who has a dream and they don't give up on it and they pursue it and they see it through. And maybe that's what the Lord is calling you to do. And if that's the case, then awesome, go with it, run with it. But maybe, just maybe, that there's something else that God is actually calling you to do, and it doesn't line up with your passions at the moment. And that's also okay. Like, it doesn't always have to be. I mean, I say this a lot, and this might be kind of cheesy or cringy to say, but like, life is mostly lived in the mundane and in the plateaus. It's not mostly lived like in the valleys down below or in the mountain peaks, but like it really is just the mundane, you know, every day. Like, I mean, sure, I love it when I get to go stargazing, but like, I don't do that every night. Like, I don't drive to Cherry Springs, which is 3 hours from Harrisburg, every single night. I did a lot, but like, the point is, like, most of my life is the sort of 8 to 5 schedule that I live, you know, with work. Most of my life isn't the exciting mountaintop moments where I'm seeing people's lives actually transformed. It's, you know, hey, let's go pick up trash or organize volunteers to do that. And I think that we set ourselves up for failure when we have this perspective of like, life needs to be exciting all the time, and I need to be pursuing my passions all the time, and I need to feel that sort of adrenaline rush all the time. Shout out to social media for ruining our brains. But I think that like it really is that sort of like main character syndrome of like, if I'm not doing everything that I love, then I feel purposeless. And I mean, honestly,
or if I can't quantify my impact.
Right. And so, I mean, as someone who struggles with that, I'm not perfect. I do struggle with those things. I've also had the luxury of realizing, no, like, life is mostly mundane, and that's not boring, and that's not depressing. It's just life. And if you can't learn to enjoy life and the mundane things, then you're never actually going to be satisfied. And so, a lot of that just kind of came out of thin air, I guess.
And I think a lot of what I'm learning right now, I'm in a time where a lot of what I'm learning and growing through is just learning self-discipline. And learning to be self-controlled, and learning to apply what I've learned in my life, and still listening, still learning, still growing. But just kind of being like, hey, you know a lot of stuff. But are you actually applying it in, like you said, in the mundane? Are you, you know, in the little disciplines of life? You know, some people, it might be the biggest chore to just get up and brush your teeth. You know?
For sure.
Or for other people, it might be something like stepping out and moving states. But I think it's just simple obedience in wherever we are. That makes the biggest differences. And it could be a big or small choice, but it's those little things that make the difference.
Absolutely. Well, I think you and I are very similar in the sense of like, I think we both can tend to be a little whimsical about life. And like, we both have a lot of dreams. We have a lot of ambitions. We have a lot of hobbies. Like, I mean, I remember when you were into beekeeping, and like, I don't know if that's something you're still into. But
Yeah. I want to get back into it, but yeah.
But see, that's the point, right? Is like, I think that so often, and it's something that I admire about you and even myself, is that like I think so often we look at hobbies or things that we might be passionate about and say like, I need to make a living out of this, or I need to like pursue this for the rest of my life, and it's like,
it has to make sense.
Exactly, and it's like, well, maybe you just do it for a little bit of time, and like you fall in love with it, or maybe you realize this isn't at all what I love. But like, I think that there is a beauty in just being willing to try new things and to step out, but it's all meaningless, to your point, if there's no obedience there as well. And so like I always think about, First Samuel chapter 15, I believe, when Saul, who's king, is commanded to kill all the Amalekites, and he basically does nothing. He does it and then stops short of like killing the king. And he's also commanded, don't keep any livestock, don't keep any treasures for yourself, right? But when Samuel shows up, he sees all of these sheep, and he hears all of the livestock, and he sees the king is still alive, and he flips out on Saul and is like, what are you doing? And Saul sort of tries to lie his way through, and he says, oh, well, I know that this is like what, I'm obviously paraphrasing, but like, he's like, I know this is what God wants, right? Like I kept the best calves and the best sheep, right, to offer as sacrifices. And Samuel says something to him which is deeply profound, which is obedience is better than sacrifice. In other words, right, like doing all of the quote unquote like right things are ultimately meaningless if you're not actually obedient to what the Lord is calling you to do. And so I like, again, there's a lot of different principles at play here, which is like God does give us the desires of our heart, and he's also the one that puts those desires there in the first place. But at the same time, like those things are ultimately for him and for his glory, not for our glory and for our gain. And so there has to be the balance of like, I love this thing. So for me, I love stargazing. I love astrophotography. Like, I have this like silly dream of, it'd be so cool to work at NASA someday. And like, I'm not even remotely smart enough for that, so don't get a big idea here. But like, it's a dream, okay? Chill, But if that ultimately never happens, it doesn't make my life meaningless, and it doesn't mean that I'm taking a wrong path, or my life. Your life can play out in a lot of different ways, and if you want to sit around and think about all those different ways, kudos to you. I don't really have time for that, or maybe the emotional maturity for that, without getting a little depressed of like, oh, if I only would have bet on the Eagles to lose the Super Bowl last year. Like, I didn't bet at all, but like, you know what I mean? Like, it's
for sure.
You don't want to get hung up like that, but I mean, bringing all that back to that simple obedience of what God is calling us to do is far more valuable and important than anything else we can spend our lives pursuing. Yeah,
that's so good, Ben. And we're kind of getting closer to the end of the haircut, so Sick. I'd love to kind of hear. This one question I love to ask people is kind of with all of this in mind and what we've been talking about, what would be some advice that you'd give to your 14-year-old self?
Probably first, don't buy that fedora that you thought was cool. It didn't age well. I got it from Buckle, so you can only imagine. It had like a cross on the side of it. But in all seriousness, I think some of the bigger advice that I look back on is one, don't be afraid to be confident in what you feel like God has called you to do. I think I spent so much of my life being so unsure and so paralyzed by making decisions. And even as a kid, I had a hard time making decisions. I can specifically remember my parents telling me at this gift shop, hey, you can pick out one gift. And I couldn't decide between this pair of binoculars and a stuffed meerkat. Like... And I probably spent like 30 minutes debating in my head, like which one is the one that I want, which one is like doing the things that I do, weighing out the pros and cons, of course. But I spent so much of my life like that, and so much of my life being afraid of making a decision. And so I think the biggest advice that I would give to my, quote unquote 14-year-old self is probably just be confident and don't be afraid to make wrong decisions, because I mean, more often than not, that's what we're making is wrong decisions. It's not a hopeless perspective. We obviously learn and grow from those decisions, but if you're just paralyzed by fear, you end up moving nowhere, and moving somewhere, even if it's in the wrong direction, is still better than moving nowhere, because I find, again, that God often speaks to me when I'm moving and when I'm willing to step out. And it's not that he's not speaking to me when I'm not, but it's that sort of like, if I'm praying, God, give me the right direction, but I'm never willing to go left or right, then, he wants that journey and that partnership with us, that relational quality that we always talk about, right? We say it's a relationship, not a religion.
Yeah.
But God is not trying to control us. And so if you're not willing to step out and try something new, even if it's really scary and even if it might be the wrong thing, again, I don't want to speak in absolutes here. It's not that he's not talking to you. It's that it's a lot harder to hear him and a lot harder to know, hey, am I actually moving in the right direction? He's not going to answer a prayer if you're also not willing to move in that direction. And so I think that's probably the biggest advice that I'd give myself is don't be afraid. Like, step out, make decisions. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to get things, right as well. But just don't be afraid. Yeah,
that's good. And just a little bonus question. I heard you say earlier, and I've been in this place too, where I feel like I've had in my kind of in my head, but in my heart, whatever you want to terminology, where it's kind of hard to explain, where you feel like God is really speaking to you.
Yeah.
And I've moved off of those kind of things I've heard, and I've seen really good things come out of it.
Yeah.
And I've seen people just be really moved to change something for the positive in their life.
Yeah.
And I've seen myself kind of move into a place where it was a more healthy place of how I was looking at things. So I felt like I've heard God really clearly, and I've grown from it.
Yeah.
But I've also been in places where I've felt like I've heard God, and then I move in that direction, and it's totally off.
Right.
You're just like what just happened? Like, God, I felt like this was you. It seemed a lot like your voice. How do you kind of deal with that kind of situation? Like when you just totally were off.
Yeah. I mean, there's always a part of me, and maybe you can relate to this, that I'm a pretty stubborn individual, and so I've definitely been at points in my life where something was clear. Like moving to DC for a year when I felt like I was supposed to be in Harrisburg is a good example, where I stayed there for a year. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a long time, but being miserable for a year is terrible, let me tell you. And so I'm saying that to say that's just the natural part of me is I've stuck with things longer than I should have. But I think honestly it's being humble enough to admit I got it wrong, and not being afraid of what other people will think of you in that sense. I mean, I know that we hear stuff like this all the time, but the truth is that most people really aren't comparing your life to theirs. They're not. They're too concerned about their own life and their own decisions and their own direction to ever be that focused on, well, Ben tried something new and it didn't really work out. I mean, some people might, but
they're wasting their time.
Exactly. Forget about those people. I think it really, you just have to be humble enough to admit, I missed the mark on this. I thought I heard your voice, Lord, and maybe I didn't. But also, I've also been in the opposite position where I'm I don't think I heard God's voice in this. I clearly missed the mark. This didn't go at all where I wanted to. And then several years down the line, I'm oh, actually,
God uses it.
This actually meant something. And I'm a mess of a person. I've made plenty of mistakes, and it is what it is. But I think just being humble enough to, excuse me. Well, being humble enough to excuse me, but being humble enough to just admit when I'm wrong. Proverbs tells us, a righteous man falls but gets up 7 times, right? And so it's not about being perfect. It's about getting back up and moving forward.
That's awesome. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, this has been fun.
Sweet. I'm going to show you the hair's looking like, and let me know what you're thinking.
I mean, the back doesn't look homeless anymore, so... That's great. Yeah, I love it. No, seriously, it's amazing. I love this.
Sweet.